I'm sure a lot of you grew up watching the promising but stunted career of Gilbert Arenas. At just 25 years old, he was on his way to a Hall of Fame career. I want to tell you a different story though, as the evolution of Arenas' career is much more complex. Considering his upbringing, his NBA peers, and his team's front offices, he had to be the difference maker if he wanted to succeed. But at the same time, with what we know from the gun incident, his innumerable pranks, and other antics, he often fostered an environment that wouldn't take him as far as he wanted. So let me know, if healthy, would Arenas have ranked up there with D-Wade, Steve Nash, and T-Mac? Could he have guided the Wizards to a championship? I'll let you decide by the end of this video, inspired by our top comment on the most cursed sports teams today. So thanks, Mario Caster Jim. This is Gilbert Arenas, the Hall of Famer that never was. Arenas arrived in Oakland to a Golden State Warriors franchise that was a perennial doormat, just 17 wins the previous season. The highly skilled but immature 20-year-old guard initially struggled to earn minutes and acclimate to the fraternity of an NBA team. He spent nearly his entire rookie salary on material items and was so broke that he slept inside the arena. That's not all too surprising given his upbringing. When his father and he moved across the country with little funds, they'd sleep in their car and in the YMCA until his dad found work. Adding to his challenges in Oakland was a level of dedication that he said not many other players embraced. He was the kid who'd be shooting hoops at 2:30 a.m. in a park, while his dad, who had sole custody, was just starting his graveyard shift. Said University of Arizona teammate Richard Jefferson, "You will never find a single person that would ever question his work ethic. Gilbert was such a student of the game. He's hyper intelligent. His work ethic is 10 out of 10. But with the mentorship of teammate Mark Jackson and the recently retired Chris Mullin, Arenas turned a corner and didn't look back. In his second year, the Dubs improved by 17 wins. Arenas played a big part in that, putting up over 18 points and 6 assists per game, and won the NBA's Most Improved Player. But even though the team was building momentum, the front office was holding them back. The Warriors were over the salary cap, and until the rules later changed, would lose the signing rights to the restricted free agent Arenas. What would have happened if Arenas stuck around some more, teaming up with Jason Richardson? Would they have done more damage in the 07 playoffs after upsetting Dirk's Mavericks? Well, if you can't decide for yourself, I guess you could always flip a coin. It's not like the Washington Wizards were much of a step up from the Warriors, as they had just won one playoff series since 1982. They were part of a struggling DC sports market that in the 80s and 90s had celebrated a Georgetown Hoyas national championship, 3 Super Bowls by the then Redskins, and the first Stanley Cup final appearance by the Capitals several years later. Now, the Wizards had recently improved from 19 to 37 wins, but did some heavy house cleaning. Out was executive Wes Unseld Sr., and in came former Knicks GM Ernie Grunfeld, who nearly guided New York to a title. The same can be said for former Nets head coach Eddie Jordan, who replaced Doug Collins. And speaking of Jordans, Michael had just hung them up for good. This revamped environment would nurture Arenas as he became the focal point of the franchise, joining once Warriors teammate Larry Hughes, veteran Jerry Stackhouse, and a young former #1 pick in Kwame Brown.
They gave up Kwame Brown. Who cares?
The first season for the team was growing pains as they regressed to 25 wins, but they'd turn it on soon after. 04-05 marked the beginning of Arenas' dominance, and with the addition of another former teammate, Antoine Jamison, it looked like the start of a promising era. This trio did something they couldn't achieve in Oakland, guiding their team to a winning record and a playoff berth. Taking on the Chicago Bulls in the first round, they dropped games 1 and 2 on the road, but rattled off 4 straight. Arenas dazzled in his first ever postseason series, averaging 23 points and over 6 boards and 6 helpers. And even though he was just 4 of 13 through the final minutes of Game 5, he saved his best jumper for last.
Here's Arenas, this for the win, yes!
Washington won its first playoff series in 23 years, but was then swept by Dwayne Wade and the Heat. That offseason, the Wizards lost Hughes in free agency to the Cavaliers, but they gained Caron Butler, forming the signature Big Three with Jamison and Arenas. Agent Zero was becoming a human highlight reel. He finished 4th in the NBA's scoring race, only behind Kobe, AI, and LeBron, whose Cavs got the best of him in round 1. The 2 missed free throws in Game 6 are definitely a blemish, but it's hard to ask much more from a guy who put up 34 a game. But I'll call a timeout here to highlight a key component of Arenas' legacy in DC. He had become a star in the community, making an impact on kids growing up in situations that probably reminded him of his upbringing. He'd spend the holiday season with hundreds of underprivileged children, taking them to see the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and giving them gifts. One of those kids, Andre McAllister, had lost his mom, sister, great-grandfather, and cousin in a house fire in 2004. Arenas had heard about this while still with the Warriors. I took him under my wing and decided that I would be his big brother, said Arenas, who bought Andre new clothes and school supplies and got him a job as a ball boy at his home games. He would donate $100 for every point he scored at home to dozens of DC area schools, drawing crowds of 1,200 students, teachers, and principals. And after each of those contests, he took off his jersey and looked for a young fan to toss it to. That's over $10,000 out of pocket per season. Sure, he'd goof off by tickling Jameson's armpit before tip-off and playing video games at halftime, but that's exactly how he won the hearts of Hoops fans and greater DC residents. He was a superstar, but rather than a traditional role model, he was organically relatable to young fans. Arenas continued to flourish the next season, averaging over 28 points, 6 assists, and just under 2 steals. As many of you remember, he set a career high against the Lakers. While the Black Mamba put up a cool 45 on just 25 shots, Arenas got to the line 27 times en route to 60 points, breaking a 38-year franchise record. His 16 in overtime set a then NBA record, and the Wizards got the win. However, Arenas doesn't consider that his greatest performance. Having not made the 2006 FIBA World Championship roster for the US, he made it a point to torch that team's coaches during the NBA season. He struggled for just 9 points against Nate McMillan's Blazers, but just 5 days after scoring 60, he was the difference maker versus Mike D'Antoni's Phoenix Suns with 54. He added a third 50-point performance the following month, too. But late in the season, he awkwardly collided with Gerald Wallace and tore his MCL. He pressured himself to get back on the court so long as he stood on 2 legs. He had plenty on the line. A team struggling to do any damage in the first round without him, a new contract that could earn him as much as $127 million, and a commitment to his fans and community. Consequently, his knee issues resurfaced just 8 games into the next year, warranting another surgery. He returned toward the end and averaged 23.5 minutes over 4 games in a first-round rematch against the Cavs, but his team was defeated once again in 6. Arenas was due for a new contract and decided on $111 million, with each one symbolizing one of his favorite players, Penny Hardaway. He figured that the remaining $16 million allowed on his max deal could be used to extend Jameson. The contract would go down as one of the worst in league history and would catalyze a franchise nosedive. Arenas missed all but 2 games in 08-09. The team started just 1-10, and by then, Ernie Grunfeld had had enough, dismissing Eddie Jordan. And while he had the 5th overall draft pick, he traded it in exchange for Mike Miller and Randy Foye when Steph Curry and DeMar DeRozan were up for grabs. The fans' faith in their team and its one superstar had begun to slip. Arenas was wasting the prime of his career at just 27.
I robbed myself of my career. You know, if I'm 25%, 50%, I'm going out there playing. And that was the ignorance of who I am. So I really robbed myself.
The next year, he regressed as a scorer, but still contributed 22.6 points and an improved 7.2 assists per game. But the offseason trades didn't pay off much, as the Wizards were just 11-21 until Arenas' suspension. I won't get into this much because it's been discussed countless times. In short, Arenas was suspended for the rest of the season because he brought several unloaded handguns, one unlicensed, into the then Verizon Center, a DC felony that also violated league policy. Yes, there are technicalities to this. Arenas was sentenced to 30 days in a halfway house, 2 years probation, and 400 hours of community service. Meanwhile, Javaris Crittenton, who pointed his own gun at Arenas, never played a professional basketball game again. Arenas was heavily criticized by making light of the situation both then and now.
Do you have regrets about how you handled all of that? Do you have regrets about bringing the guns in the first place? Do you have regrets about any of the other stuff that happened with it?
Just lie and say yes. Just lie and say yes.
But I can't do that.
It was hard for him to accept the spectrum of consequences from his conduct and move on. You can do 100 things right. You make one mistake, it erases your whole legacy. I couldn't sleep at night with that. That's just where I lost the love. Despite the suspension helping the Wizards land John Wall, Grunfeld was failing to guide the team in the direction it needed to travel, refusing to void Arenas' contract. Arenas returned to the court, and despite his productivity, lacked the explosiveness and finesse of his glory days. Starting 14 of 21 games, he managed a respectable 17.3 points and 5.6 assists, but shot under 40%. The Wizards went 5-16 with him and traded him to the Orlando Magic for Rashard Lewis. Not even 2 months later, he returned to DC with Orlando and was generally welcomed in his new jersey. But from here on out, Arenas would disconnect himself from the franchise and community. He had departed without saying goodbye to the same employees he had charmed for years. After his career, he declined John Wall's game invitations and he'd reroute his flights if they connected through a DC airport. I didn't touch on his final games in Orlando or Memphis, as he was largely a backup who couldn't average double-digit points. He had played his final NBA game at the age of 30. I mentioned in a separate video how in sports, time has a way of healing wounds between an athlete and their fans. When we flash forward a decade after Arenas' NBA career ended, we see a Wizards fanbase starving for something to enjoy, as they were no longer with John Wall and in the middle of the team's 5th straight losing season. The Wizards reunited the Big Three at Capital One Arena. For Arenas, it was a chance to see some of the faces he couldn't bid farewell to in 2010, to hear the cheers from adults who were kids when he was putting up 40 and 50 points there, to sign his jersey in his cathedral, to feel that love he lost during the suspension. Arenas was childish yet poised, an acquired taste and yet the best teammate to some of the game's greats, a beacon of benevolence and relatability for an enthused community that, while grateful for his performances, needed time to forgive him for his worst actions. Were he able to play out his prime, he'd likely be in the hall with the Tracy McGrady's and the Grant Hills and the Vlade Divacs. Okay, none of them were ever suspended, but you know what? There'd still be room for Agent Zero. After all, it's called the Hall of Fame, not the Hall of doing everything right. So do you think that Gilbert Arenas should be in the Hall of Fame? And if he stayed healthy, would the Wizards have won a championship? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to shout out other ideas for videos like this, whether that's basketball or otherwise. Really, Arenas was an enigmatic figure, to say the least. This is a perfect quote to sum things up. For every act of kindness, there was an act of selfishness or immaturity. I didn't really get into his multitude of pranks, like how he took a shit in Andre Blatch's shoe, or how he would trash locker rooms, but on the flip side, this guy really did make an impact on thousands out there in his community, like how he paid for his assistant trainer's honeymoon with his playoff salary, what he did for Andre McAllister and these other boys whose father had been murdered by letting them sit on the bench during Wizards home games for the rest of the season. So Gil did quite a lot of great in his community, but certainly at the very least, he is just one hell of an interesting personality out there. I could probably make several dozen more videos of him. Before you go, if you enjoy my content and want to support my work, tap the join button down below. You'll get some member benefits, and certainly you'll be supporting me as a creator. If everybody gave $1, we could take this channel in some very exciting directions. So I'd love for you to be a part of that. Anyway, I appreciate you guys so much for watching. I'm Nick, and I'll see you right here next time on Sudden Death Sports.